I'm Henrietta. 2020. It's been a memorable year. Join me as I talk with four journalists who'll share their thoughts about 2020 and where it will lead us in 2021. All on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for our conversation today on 2020, a year in review. You are all four esteemed journalists, and I'll do brief introductions of you for our audience who may not know you. Jocelyn Dong is the editor of the Palo Alto Weekly and Palo Alto Online. She's covered community news in the Palo Alto area for 2 decades. And Jocelyn is wearing the earphones. Emily Miebach covers South San Mateo County for the Palo Alto Daily Post. Gennady Shaner is a staff writer at the Palo Alto Weekly, where he covers City Hall, regional politics, and land use issues. And Vandana Kumar is the founder and publisher of India Currents, formerly a print publication, now digital. It operates out of the South Bay, and it's more than 30 years old. A year ago, I did a show, and it was The Power of 2020. It was done a year ago, and at the time, I talked with my guests about how we had two exciting things, Census 2020 and the presidential election. Well, 2020 had a lot of power. And I'll open this up for each of you to give your perspective on some of the things that made it so powerful. So who'd like to start?
I can start.
Okay, Vandana.
Yeah. So as you said, we all started planning for Census 2020. That was the big event that was going to happen at the start of the year. And at the end of the year was the elections. And Henrietta, you and I did a campaign for Census 2020 together. We started on that, feeling this is what we are going to be, empowering our people, informing people, making sure everyone's counted. That was going to be the big thing. Then, of course, COVID-19, a global pandemic. None of us have ever been in a pandemic before. We don't know how to handle it. We didn't know. And I remember, just a small anecdote, that when we were told to shelter in place, we all sort of hunkered down. And I told all my friends and family, 2 weeks, we're not doing anything, And I don't know what we imagined. We didn't know. We had no idea, nothing to base that on. So 2 weeks, and now I think back and laugh about it and say that 2 weeks? What was that all about? How is a global pandemic? But this just talks about ignorance, what we don't know. The pandemic and how people had to deal with it, with their lives upended like overnight, in the way they worked, the way they educated, the way they handled their health, the way they handled family gatherings, weddings, graduations. Like, it was discovery for all of us as a community, trying to find best ways to do things.
So, Vandana, I'm going to stop you and pick up on two things that you said. You said none of us have been in a pandemic before, and it was means of discovery. So I'm going to throw that out to the rest of you and say, well, was that an assumption? Have any of you been in a pandemic before? Gennady.
I'm just raising my hand to speak. I wasn't around in 1918, but I absolutely agree with Vandana. Like, every conversation of 2020 has to begin and end with pandemic, even though so much else was happening throughout the whole year. everything is kind of seen through that prism. I remember like one of the most memorable days, and it's kind of one of the iconic photos of the year. It was August 16th when we had like 12,000 lightning strikes over like 3 days that started then, that completely like obliterated the area. And you had all these crazy photos of like Bay Bridge with lightning bolts like webbing out over the bridge, and there were wildfires for months. To me, that photo of lightning bolts is kind of like the journalist's brain in 2020, because of all the stuff we had to discover, like especially since the mid-March when shelter in place took over. I feel like no matter what beat we've been covering, we've all become pretty much COVID reporters. Like I've never done health before, but everybody on our team has contributed to in some way or another. So yeah, I absolutely agree that this has been a year of discovery. I think that's the most generous way to describe it. And I expect we'll see a little bit more of that in 2021, though. I think the next year is going to be a little more of like that.
We'll see.
Photo.
We'll see. So, Emily, when I had asked if any of you had been in a pandemic before, it seems like that triggered something that you were about to say.
No, never been in a pandemic, Henrietta, until now. No, what I was thinking about as Gennady was speaking is, yeah, I think a lot of reporters just did every single beat in one way or another, between the election, the protests, the fires, and COVID. You were doing a little bit of everything. There was a lot of training of, okay, here's how you now report on health, and here's the in and outs of it in an hour, because you now have to go and interview someone about it, I think was a lot of how it went. And it completely upended election season, for better or worse. I know Jocelyn, before we started, was talking about doing the weekly's election night on Zoom. And that was very different. I know for us, we interviewed a lot of candidates over Zoom, and haven't met them in person yet. Whether or not they've been elected, I think that has been an interesting change, is just the lack of talking to people in person.
Yes, Jocelyn, has that been your experience too?
Yeah, that is so interesting, because it was a year ago, I think February, that we held a state Senate debate at the Palo Alto Art Center auditorium. And there were hundreds of people there, like packed like sardines, to listen to these 7 people talk about why they wanted to be our next state senator. And can you just imagine that scene today? All those people together, everyone just took it for granted, because none of us had been in a pandemic before. None of us had to like separate from one another for months on end. And, everything that's happened since then has just taken such a toll on people. The isolation, the caution, everyone's having to think through, should I be doing this? Is this safe? What are the risks associated with seeing my friend, walking outside, everything like that, going to the grocery store. So we've really seen quite a shift from just 1 year ago till now, and we've seen it in every aspect of daily life, as well as certainly in journalism. Like Emily was saying, we thought COVID was going to be the big thing, and it was. But then, hey, there's police brutality and protests from that, and hey, there's wildfires, and hey, there's this weird election season.
Yes. It's interesting. Until Gennady mentioned it, I had forgotten all about the wildfires, and that was a big thing. So we started off with the census. Then there were, I think, the wildfires, or the Black Lives Matter movement. We can't hear you, Gennady.
Yeah, I think the Black Lives Matter protests preceded it, because May 25th was the George Floyd death in Minneapolis. And even though obviously Black Lives Matter has been around for years, I think those huge citywide protests were mostly like late May, early June is when they started. And I think the fires really began in earnest like mid-August, late August.
Yeah.
So it seems almost everything that could have happened happened in 2020. And it ended incredibly with the president refusing to say that he lost and greet the new president. So where does that leave us for 2021? Or is there more that you would like to say about 2020? Did we miss anything that was major and not just now?
Well, we're local reporters, so I'm sure a lot of the stuff that we think of as major is filtered through the local lens. I feel like Trump and insurrection, I know we're on to next year already, but 2020 is pre-insurrection. Before we had an insurrection in the middle of a pandemic during a contested election and the second impeachment, things were a little simpler. But yeah, there were a lot of local elections where measures passed or didn't pass, new mayors elected, new council members, political dynamics changing. And there's also, in addition to the huge health toll from COVID, I feel like it's upended like every sector. We're talking about education, restaurants.
Okay.
In the beginning of the year, I was celebrating Parasite winning an Oscar. And then 2 months later, I was wondering if I'm ever going to go to the movies again. So it's like, in a sense, like I said, COVID is everywhere, but there's all these peripheral impacts that I feel like in any other year would have been like the biggest story of the year. Like the fact
yes, I'm thinking, yes, go on.
And also, it wasn't just a pandemic that we were experiencing here. This is a global pandemic. And, my readers are largely first-generation immigrants that still have ties to India. And the fact that you can travel, the fact that we all have ties and we travel to India back and forth to see our family members, parents, grandparents, siblings, whatever. We're not able to do that. In fact, one of the biggest stories for us, was the fact when India shut its borders. And it went like wildfire for our readership. It's like, what do you mean? We can't go there? So, in so many ways, people have, it's been 9 months, 10 months. We're all still trying to figure out how are we going to connect with our loved ones? What does it mean when you can't hug someone anymore? And I think Jocelyn and Janani both said that. It's changed the way we look at every activity that we're doing.
Well, for some reason or other, when you talked about not being able to go to India, that reminded me of the whole issue of immigration in the US and the children in cages. Now, that was before the pandemic, right? That was 2019?
19, yes.
Yes, and that's a story that's continuing on into 2021. And I heard that many of those children, some newborn, have not been reunited with their parents or their mothers.
They're unable to find them, apparently, to find the parents. So it's just, I feel that all of us have had so many things thrown at us. Like, you have to think about the resilience of the human spirit, that we are weathering, one thing after another. And just when you think like, oh God, this really cannot get any worse, then, we have the fires. Like the fires, Janani, that you spoke about, I'd actually forgotten about it at the moment. But for me, that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. For months on end, we've been told, stay at home, stay safe. And then the fires happened and they came very close to my house. My brother was evacuated and he moved over to my house. And then we were told to evacuate. And that night, I didn't know what to do. I had
in San Jose. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
The foothills right here. I'm on the foothills. And we were told to evacuate. And I said, I just cannot deal with this. I just don't know what to do anymore. Like, do you give up? Like, I've been telling myself for months on end, stay home, stay safe. Stay home, stay safe. Now, stay home is no longer safe. So where do I go? And it's terrifying even for I think of myself as a very strong person, and I'm sure all of us who are doing this work, you see a lot, you learn a lot, but the human spirit, the reason why so many people are dealing with mental issues as well, is the fact that how much can you take?
It's very interesting. I heard a caller into a radio program talk about some of the mental issues that those who went to the Capitol might have had in their frustration. And the caller said, you don't find people who are well educated, who are thinking well, resorting to that type of activity. So when you talk about the happenings of 2020 taking a toll, it could very well be that that was part of the toll taken, all of the stresses and the pressures building up.
I do think, Henrietta, that 2020 revealed so much about our society that beyond like the individual events, beyond George Floyd's killing, beyond the wildfires, there was just this kind of ongoing theme of the pandemic has just revealed, or exacerbated, some of our disparities. So people who are of lower income, they lost their jobs disproportionately to those with high incomes, those with less education, kind of in the same thing. People who live in denser housing are more susceptible to the virus spreading, as opposed to those who are more well off. They're, in their homes, their individual homes, able to watch Netflix and, just have kind of this pandemic experience that's wholly different from people who are less well off. And so I just look at 2020 as this like lens of seeing all the disparities in our country, and certainly, I mean, we need to touch upon the racial disparities and police brutality and police reform, because those are issues that continue on with us. I mean, there's a lot of actions that have been taken and some actions that haven't been taken to move us from where we found ourselves in May and June to somewhere better. And it's still falling, just like the pandemic. It's still with us. We need to see some healing. We need to see some movement on that front as well. So 2020 was this really awful year that somehow also kind of showed us a mirror, to our country, because we were all so stressed out. And I'm not saying that these things happened because we were stressed, but in that kind of milieu of stress, we kind of saw ourselves, unfortunately, a little bit clearer, both on the good and the bad. I mean, I don't want to. Vandana was talking about resilience, and there are so many people who were charitable and just reaching out to people who were struggling. I mean, that was totally happening this year as well. So I don't want to, be only the glass half empty.
It seems that 2020 was the year when a lot of things fell apart. Whatever that could happen, happened. And when you have things fall apart and break down, then some would think that that's an opportunity to build it all over again, or to build things up out of the ashes. And Jocelyn, you just now talked about the disparities. And yes, it's those with less income who are the essential workers who are out there more prone, with more exposure to COVID-19. And you also talked about police reform. So let's get into that. Janati said, not necessarily just police reform, but Janati said all politics is local. Did you say all politics is local?
I did not make that up.
What did you say? Oh, that's local.
As reporters for local papers, we tend to cover more city council meetings and congressional hearings, so we tend to focus on local issues. But certainly the things that happen nationwide, especially the pandemic, have affected us all.
So let's Jocelyn mentioned police reform. So in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, where are we now when you look at it on a local level in terms of police reform? What came out of that for Palo Alto, for San Jose, where you are, Vandana? Anything meaningful that you could point to?
I mean, one of the things that was very big was Menlo Park's police chief resigning in the middle of a city council meeting. That was a shock watching that meeting. And because of Dave Bertini leaving Menlo Park in July, the city hasn't really done too much as far as reform. And I think there have been very small changes in most of the cities, at least of the ones that I cover, but not the sweeping reform that was being asked for, demanded over the summer. Part of San Mateo County is just now doing a pilot program, sending clinicians, out with police officers. I think Palo Alto was discussing doing the same thing. And that's just starting. Actually, that'll begin in April, almost a year later. I think things have just been very slow, and I've been thinking about whether or not that is just kind of the Palo Alto way, I think, as things are described, because it takes many a hearing and to get anything done around here, or if it's COVID and Zoom slowing everything down to a glacial pace.
So, Janati, you covered the city council, Palo Alto City Council.
Yeah, I actually do think they accomplished a few things. I mean, anything they do would take a while, as Emily said, but by Palo Alto process standards, they actually were able to finish a few things. They revised the police policies to kind of make it more consistent with the 8 Can't Wait platform, so banning all sorts of chokehold and chokehold-like moves. They have a lot more in their policies about de-escalation now. That was all in response to the protests. The officer who was involved in the Buena Vista beating was arrested. There were some symbolic things like a resolution. The city just commissioned a history of Black and brown Palo Alto residents that they're going to be discussing next week. And those are mostly symbolic, but as far as like the police policies, I think those are somewhat meaningful. And also, the city council late last year changed the scope of the police auditor's contract. So they will no longer consider internal disputes between officers. And the new city council, partly influenced by what's been happening, is now pretty bent on kind of reversing that action and kind of giving the auditor more power to monitor things in the department. So I think those are concrete things. Obviously, if our standard is that defund the police happen and things, well, actually, if that's our standard, that also happened because of budget problems, not because of ideology. But I think there's been some movement in Palo Alto, and there should be more in 2021 based on what candidates had said during the election season.
Given the what took place at the Capitol on January 6th, it seems this whole idea of the police has really come back to the forefront, because there's some thinking that, well, there were police officers who were involved in that. And many are talking about how police forces have been infiltrated by white nationalists and military people who might very well share some of those white nationalist Proud Boys attitudes. So I'm wondering if any of that infiltration has been seen on a local level in terms of local police officers. Have any of you heard anything about that?
I haven't.
Any police officers going to the Capitol attack, but if I do hear, that's the report on that. But
sure,
Palo Alto's had its own problems. They're not near as what we've seen when people are trying to overthrow democracy. But there's been plenty of incidents in Palo Alto where you could, if you watch the body camera footage, you will know that there's some certain biases being exhibited. So it's not too surprising that there's been some police officers involved in that mess, considering the kinds of candidates police unions tend to endorse and the kinds of politicians they tend to gravitate towards.
Well, Janati, you talked about local elections, and I'm thinking in terms of local elections, what would you say major in this election locally even countywide or nationally, that was achieved. Other than the Biden win, I know there was Palo Alto's Park. That was
a big one. I think that also kind of had a little bit to do with the June thing. I mean, even though the issue preceded, like, the protest, certainly the fact that ACLU and WACP get involved.
When you say the June thing, do you mean the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, all the protests that happen, and they have
yes,
talking about Black Lives Matters. I think there's a tangential connection to that, even though it's not super direct. But
for those, say a little bit more about the opening of that park, Jocelyn or Gennady, for those in our audience who might not know the significance of that.
Sure, it's been for decades. Palo Alto has been debating whether to open Foothills Park to non-Palo Alto residents. Since 1965, there's been a law that restricts access just to residents and their guests. And many Palo Alto former mayors and community activists and prominent like civic leaders like Doris Cordell have argued that it's a terrible policy and it's unjust, and it kind of perpetuates the racial inequities that go back to the 60s and blockbusting and redlining. And so in August, the Palo Alto took what was then for them a big action in approving a sort of pilot program, which would allow 50 non-residents per day to go to Foothills Park. And then they were hit like a month later with a lawsuit from ACLU and WACP and 10 residents from Palo Alto and other cities basically saying that's not enough, you got to abolish the policy. And in November, the council did just that. They basically said,
well, I was really surprised when that park opened to hear interviews of people from Cupertino and all over the Bay Area who said, "Oh, we never knew there was such a beautiful park here." And talking about parks, Vandana, there was an issue on the ballot where I know you probably were aware of it, that involved preserving major parkland in San Jose.
I don't believe we were involved in that one. I don't remember that.
A measure that would preserve parkland?
I don't remember the details. Honestly, the fact that the national politics was overwhelming. Of course, there were lots of local issues. I know that, but this one, I don't seem to remember at the moment. Since you were talking about elections, this was also the first elections in which a large community that reads and follows our newspaper, the Indian American community has taken part in a very, very big way. There was an organization formed called They See Blue. So They See Blue. It's actually, the word they see is a word that we Indians call ourselves.
Spell it.
It's actually, while it's a clever mix of They See Blue, but it's also They See Blue. So the people who are trying to turn the states blue. And these organizations worked so hard, phone banking, in all the purple states, in Atlanta, in Georgia, and in several states. And there's a sense of empowerment, that comes to people when they feel they have a voice, they have a role, and each one of us has a role to play in our democracy. And maybe we all had the time, maybe a lot of people were working from home, which gave them some time, that they were so actively engaged. And it was wonderful to see the results when they came out, when they released the information about where were the states that they were active and how many phone calls were made, targeted to, here, we just need to move the needle just a little bit, and we need to reach out to every single person. And so I think, it's coming of age for the Indian American community. This election really was one that drew people in record numbers.
That's interesting. Sure. And it's thought that it's that drawing in record numbers of people of color throughout this country that really changed the election in Georgia and changed it nationally for Biden. What else would you say, Jocelyn, Janati, Emily, that came out of the election, locally, nationally, that will be a major factor or influence in 2021?
Well, I just want to make an offhand comment that I was actually thinking that there was a silver lining of COVID on the election, and certainly it was activism that people had time and they felt like they could get involved. But it also spared us from all of the many campaign events that normally would have taken place, the large scale events and the media following the candidates from place to place, that just ramps everything up. It's almost like, in the normal election year, you just can't get away from, another rally, another speech. And in some ways, I felt like it gave us some breathing room this year to really kind of look at what people's policies were, or to examine things beyond rhetoric, because unfortunately I feel like rhetoric is still plaguing us in terms of how people relate to one another and how politicians frame their platforms. I think the one thing that's going to carry over into 2021 is an opportunity, actually, with the Democrats controlling presidency and Congress. They're facing a situation in which we still have half of the country who thinks one way. I mean, just this is broad brush, but half of the country thinks one way and half of the country thinks another. And it seems to me an opportunity for the Democrats to actually practice compromise with Republicans in order to kind of bring us all together. It's certainly a position where if you're in the dominant seat, you can do what you want, basically. But if the Democrats do move forward with that, we'll still have half of the country thinking another way. And I've got a political science professor who says democracy was founded on compromise, and we sort of have forgotten that. I mean, we're not the United States, we're like the two-camp states. And I've heard so many people this year just say, oh, I wish there was a third party. I just wish there was a way to move away from just people yelling at each other from two different sides. How do we come together? So I think that's something that we'll still need to be dealing with in 2021.
That's interesting. I heard just today that this was a year tailor-made for Biden to be president. In responding to what you just now said, he has said that he will be the president of all of the people. And it said that he's had a lot of pain and tragedy in his life, and therefore he's very empathetic. He's worked with McConnell for 40 years, and the two of them are just about good friends. So it could very well, Jocelyn, it could very well be that this will be the year that those compromises will be made. Now, there is something when you started talking that you reminded me of when you talked about something coming out of the election. And I was thinking, yes, it was something that might have been very good, and yet at the same time brought us to where we are as far as Trump is concerned in terms of our current difficulties. And that's mail-in ballots. And this was a time, wasn't this the year where they were used far more because of the pandemic than any other year? And I'm just thinking that might be a real change for future elections. And that had an awful lot of impact. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that there was a lot of nervousness around the mail-in ballots, a lot of discussion, a lot of conspiracies and fears about whether or not people are putting their ballots in the correct box, or if there's a fake box and their ballots are going to be stolen away. So, I mean, I think we made it through pretty well. Now I'm on the side of trusting, the election officials. There's fraud here or there, but nothing major scale. So yeah, I think we might be into a new era of how we vote. I think it'll increase participation in the long term. So yeah, and the systems, hopefully, knock on wood, can only get better and better in terms of processing and ease of access and things like that. Because San Mateo County's been doing it for, I think, 2 years, and Santa Clara County since March. So locally, at least, we're on our way.
Sure. Other thoughts in terms of that? I'm sure none of you went to the polls, did you, to vote?
No, nail it. Yeah, I mean, one quick thought about Jocelyn's point of compromise. I'm not sure which Republican Party you guys have been watching, but I do think the Democrats will be compromising a lot this year, but mostly with each other. Because you have Joe Manchin, who's conservative from West Virginia, and he's going to have to find common ground with the most left-wing Democrats in the Senate. So by nature, whatever they come out is going to be pretty centrist. And I don't think the people who are denying that the election was fair are going to be kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of policy. But I also have a thought about Henrietta's comments that this is like a year tailor-made for Joe Biden's presidency. And I do agree with that because I feel like that's a huge shift in the in the way the nation was going because of the obvious contrast you could see just based on who he's appointing to his cabinets. But I also feel like both locally and nationally, voters kind of went for the familiar, the comforting, what they know. And even though the results are dramatically different on both levels, it's a huge swing in Washington. Peninsula, it's pretty much, we went for the same people we know because everything else is changing at such a dizzying speed. So you have people in Palo Alto who push the message a lot of people believe in, Black Lives Matters, defund the police to some extent, but they didn't win. The people who won were the people who've been in politics for decades. The incumbent candidates, the former mayor, Mountain View returned 2 council members who served a while ago, Sally Lieber and Pat Showalter. East Palo Alto returned back 2 council members, although Larry Moody was the lone exception to this trend.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's the one arena where we went for something where we actually could predict what's going to happen and we actually have some familiarity. But yeah, very different effect locally versus nationally on how that's playing out.
Definitely. I know Redwood City was another one. Jeff G. Had been off council, a former mayor, and came back. And aside from one incumbent ousted, everyone stayed the same there. And Menlo Park, you had to pick someone new because they went to districts. But it was Jen Willison, who has been at council meetings, I think, constantly for about 5 years. So everyone in City Hall knew her already. And definitely Palo Alto, I know we were kind of betting, Pat Burt is going to get reelected because everyone knows him.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. He was the highest vote getter.
Well, I think it's, in addition to everybody knowing a candidate, it's also being somebody who's appealing, maybe who constituents trust and who they agree with. And when it comes to Pat Burt, I guess he was a figure that had a lot of respectability. and there's nothing like experience, right? It's difficult when you've been in the city for 6 months to run as a candidate, a real viable candidate. Do you think? Unless the incumbent is just really, really awful, whom you're running against.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the people who are very, very new candidates didn't do very well this election. And the people who've been around for a long time, even those who happen to be really polarizing, they all did well. Just because my sense is people just want somebody who they know where they're coming from. Just no more surprises 2020.
None more surprise. Well, 2021 has really started. Somebody said,
no for a change.
Somebody said 2020, they like that sound, 2020. 2021 just doesn't sound like a lot of power in it, does it? And everybody said, oh, thank goodness we're in a new year and look at how it started. So I'm thinking the assumption was that the new year would be better than the one passing, but look at what we have and what's to come. Vandana, you're going to say something, were you?
I said that 2020 is going to go down as the year of infamy.
Infamy? I think also what's going to go down as infamy is the insurrection, if you can call it an insurrection at the Capitol. So what do you predict in terms of the inauguration?
Please. Are you asking me?
All of you. That's the next big hurdle that we have to get through.
Knocking on wood, I don't want to see another insurrection, but by all accounts, it looks like it's going to happen. I mean, the whole place is a war zone now. There's fences everywhere. You can't get in anywhere near the Capitol. So, I mean,
you remind me, I heard somebody say that I was in Iran. This is what the person said. And there were fences all over the place. And this person said, well, at least it's not like that in our U.S. Capitol. So, and he said, it looks like a war zone. And so what does that bring us to in this country where people are saying, this is almost unimaginable, where you've come from a point where you could just walk into the U.S. Capitol or walk into the White House. And now it's difficult even getting near those places.
Well, I think Jocelyn was insightful earlier on when she said that the pandemic kind of showed us who we are. And I think this event, the insurrection, also did in a way because we've had years of like a slow boil white supremacist message coming out of all those right-wing sources. And we had a president stoking these fears, everybody saying not to take them literally. And obviously now, this is what happened. This is the culmination. So as we head into 2021, this thing that we used to just shrug off and being like, it's just a fringe, nothing horrible. Like we see that this is a real danger and people are getting arrested. And I think under the Biden presidency and Attorney General Merrick Garland is going to have plenty of time to try to dismantle the white supremacy networks. And
to see what cooperation there was within the state capitol itself coming from U.S. representatives who might have given a tour the day before, letting those who broke in know where things were. Now,
I mean, hard to say what's going to come of the investigation, but I mean, it's easy to say that no one's going to be taking it for granted anymore, the issue. We're going back to U.S. grants dismantling the KKK next year. So we'll see what happens.
Yes. Now, this is one for you, the journalist. What about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram closing accounts like Trump's account? So what will we see? The press is always talking about censorship. So what does that mean in terms of social media and the power of social media? What do you think is going to happen with social media itself? Will Facebook be broken up? Now, that's a lot of questions in one, but starting place.
I think Facebook has a good chance of being broken up. I mean, I'm not saying I don't have any insight knowledge, but just based on the recent political developments, I feel like breaking up big tech is one of the few areas where the Democrats could find compromise with the Republicans. I feel like Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz could both talk about how much they hate Facebook. What else? What else is a better unifying message? So, and it's also not lost on me that they suspended all the accounts the day that Democrats took the Senate and are about to take over all the committees overseeing them. I mean, of course, I'm sure the insurrection played a role, but they're savvy politically. So I do expect to see some regulatory action on big tech, but that's
Emily,
just the ball.
Jocelyn, Vandana, censorship?
Sure. I mean, we saw some of it back to a little bit what Gennady was talking about earlier with white supremacy over the summer during the BLM protests. There were some counter protesters, and there was the Boogaloo boy up in Oakland and Santa Cruz who shot the police officers, and that's just it snowballed even more, and Facebook kind of tried and just deleted everything that had the word Boogaloo. And Reddit did that as well, I believe. So there might be more of that attempt of just finding a word or phrase or whatever and trying to get rid of it, but something more will boil up. It's like whack-a-mole, it seems like at this point. And there's going to have to be a larger breaking up of social media, or something that would kind of quiet things down. I'm not sure what it would be, though.
Henrietta, I have mixed feelings about everything that has happened. For one thing,
Everything?
technology, no, with technology. And, what is censorship? And social media has grown exponentially, and today influences millions and billions of people. What has not kept up with everything is regulations around that. They are so big, they have to be regulated because they take no responsibility. You can't take the cover of the First Amendment and not, we are just a platform anyone can share. Like, we're all publishers, right? We all are responsible for the content that we put out. Why is social media not responsible for that? For any content that's on their site, they have to be held responsible. And there has to be regulation around whether it means breaking them up, whether it's calling them like have they actually become like a utilities, or have they, there are discussions that have to be made and decisions have to be made that this cannot be a free for all. When we say the First Amendment, and all of you know that, you can't yell fire in a theater that's full of people. So there are limitations, right? And the fact that they're not held responsible at all has made this unfettered. And while they're clamping down on all of these accounts, suddenly the day after, to what Janari said, it's political. They're politically savvy. Hey, something's going to come. I better do it. But when half the country is divided and about that many people are looking to find a place, they will find a place. It may not be on Twitter, but it'll be a Twitter equivalent. Maybe Trump.
No, go on. Did you finish the sentence?
Yeah, I wanted maybe Trump will start a media empire and it will be not on Amazon. It will be whatever it is, like what I'm saying is someone will fund that because there is a need. And in the market, there's a need, somebody is going to do it.
If there are going to be regulations in terms of social media, I'm thinking the press, traditional media, doesn't operate in a vacuum. And you have Fox News, which some might say should be regulated. So would these regulations begin to affect the rest of us somehow or other?
I think we already have regulations.
Yes, we do. But how would what's happening or what might happen with social media? Yeah, there are certain laws that would hold us accountable if we commit libel and things like that. But I think in a like social media platforms don't have those kinds of laws. But also, just in addition to what Vandana was saying in terms of these social networks operating with impunity and posting whatever they want, and if you shut them down, somebody will go somewhere else. I think all of that is true. But I think aside of this kind of culture of impunity, there's also the fact that, or at least to me, it seems almost factual, that they're all monopolies. And so it's fine if you have a place to go. It's a little less fine if that place controls all information, like in the globe, and feeds the numbers to those that get the most inflammatory rhetoric and the most clicks, and just kind of snowballs that. So I think there's always going to be a place to go, but I think if there's regulation to curtail some of the monopoly powers, I don't think it'll be as big of an existential threat as if you have like one or two networks controlling the entire global conversation. Sure, Jocelyn.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It seems like the monopoly aspect is just, it's like the big hammer. It's like the big gorilla in the room. If you have small gorillas or many hammers, then it's not as potent an effect. Let me think about those analogies for a second.
Or you have all of these hammers, all of these gorillas with hammers.
Yeah,
I don't know.
They're uncoordinated hammers and gorillas.
So you don't know where anything is coming from, or will one be just as bad as the other?
We can have small bad ones, but we'll also have small good ones. I think what we're dealing with really, though, is, we're really trying to grapple with a kind of a trend in our society of extremism versus the moderation, the moderate middle. And how do we not empower this extremist element, many different elements in their own extreme ways, by giving them tools like Facebook and Twitter to gather followers and to talk with one another and plan insurrections and what have you. It's really a kind of an ongoing challenge that we're still grappling with, and I agree regulation is part of the solution, and just trying to keep at figuring out what are the implications to our society, really, of having empowered extremist elements.
Well, there is something called the First Amendment and freedom of the press, right? Free speech. So what we're talking about is limiting free speech. So don't we get into a tricky area where it's something that has always been valued? But of course, you can't predict which way something is going to go and how it's going to be used. And what it was always said is, well, you don't have free speech to shout fire in a crowded theater. But we're talking about limiting free speech. That's what the advocates of Parler, the Facebook alternative, has always said, until it was limited.
Yeah, we're totally talking about that slippery slope between talk and action, and action that leads to violence, goes along with the shouting fire in a theater, crowded theater, restriction on free speech.
Well, let's talk. Yeah, go on.
No,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Let's talk about the future of the press itself. That came under a lot of fire during the Trump administration, fake news. And then there was a rise of social media. And the distrust of so many people in traditional media. So where does that leave us? What are the challenges now that we face as journalists? And what can we do about it? And what do you foresee happening in terms of the role of the press in 2021?
Well, distrust in the media mainstream news media has never been higher. I think Pew came out with a study this fall, late December, just showing how very few people actually trust what is being presented to them in the media. And I think transparency is one thread that news organizations are trying to use to kind of communicate what it is that we do, what our purpose is, how we go about it. It's easy and cheap to throw accusations out at journalists, when an article comes out or a news TV story or whatever comes out that they don't like. But if we as journalists say, okay, this is how we operate, these are the people that we go to, this clearly shows you that we're not acting out of bias because we contacted all these different people. Transparency is one thing that I think is an industry that we're paying a lot more attention to now than we ever have before, because of the perceptions of us that are just plain wrong. The idea is that we're just making up stuff. Whatever we think people should believe, we're writing it out. It's like, no, that's not what we do at all. So education is one part of it, trying to bring back reasonable thinking people to understand that they can trust the media.
Other thoughts on that? I see the head shaking.
Yeah, I think we have an advantage because we're local people, we're local journalists, and I feel like while there's certain distrust of media of all kinds, I feel like national New York Times and CNN and Fox News probably get more ire than the reporter who you see at council meetings every week. I mean, our pool is fairly small, so I think we personally know a lot of the people we write about, which mitigates it a little bit, but that's
Now,
the challenges you mentioned aren't real, because they absolutely are.
I was going to say, knowing them and they knowing us, that doesn't mean we're in bed with them, right?
Of course not.
You know, with so much media being produced everywhere, globally, people are inundated with all kinds of stuff that's available. Social media adds to that. But today, anyone with a phone is a reporter, and they are producing content, whether it's documenting, hey, where I went, what did I do, what did I cook, but it's all media that's coming our way. And sometimes it feels like a deluge. You know, there's just so much stuff that's thrown at you. So then what do you pay attention to? I think Janadi said an important point, you know, you're local. So people gravitate towards their interest and to people or organizations they trust. To a certain extent, the smaller community-based organizations, local press, ethnic media, they still have a little more close contact with the communities that they write about. And to some extent, I believe it makes them trusted messengers.
It makes us more accountable, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes, it does. Well, I love at this point in time during my show to go around the table, and we can't quite go around the table, but to have you share famous last words, whatever it is we didn't cover that you think is important, whatever it is we did cover that you'd like to say more about. So anything you've been holding back on or feel very passionate about? Jocelyn.
Sure. Well, I'm hopeful that some of the human kindness that we've seen extended during the COVID pandemic will actually continue on, even when we get back to normal and get back to our super busy Silicon Valley lives. I mean, I hope that some of the connections that we've made, you know, person to person, not having anything to do with politics or not having to do with any of the, you know, things that could divide us, but just human to human, reaching out to one another. I certainly hope that continues. And that would be a silver lining on a really weird 2020.
Sure. Emily.
Gosh, you know, I completely agree with Jocelyn. It would be very nice to see some niceness continue and just grow, especially because some of the things we've seen even locally have been extremely divisive. And I'm hopeful that maybe with more moderate aspects coming in politically, both locally at some point and nationally, that some of that regular decency will return on some level.
Sure, Janadi.
Well, it's been grueling this thing going back to 2020 and reliving the PTSD of everything that happened. But I did get a call this morning from my parents who let me know that they just made their appointment for a vaccine, which they'll be getting later this month. So in some ways, I do have some hope going into the new year. There'll be a new administration. There's going to be possibly a 1.9 trillion economic package that's going to recoup some of the money that's been lost responding to pandemic. Hopefully by spring, summer, all of us will have our vaccines and we can start kind of completing the recovery. Maybe I'll go back to the movie theater by the end of the year. Maybe we'll go back to the restaurants. And hopefully, if nothing else, we're all going to have a lot more awareness about the racial inequities, the social inequities that COVID exposed and that the recent protests have exposed and that the more recent insurrection has exposed. And we can all learn from that and kind of work toward a better 2021.
Sure. Vandana.
I'm going to piggyback off something Jocelyn said earlier. You know, 2020 sort of gave a mirror, showed ourselves in a mirror. And it exposed so many of the inequities that we all face. And all of you have already said that, so I won't repeat it. But it's also made me very grateful for all the things that I do have in my life. And I think a lot of people are looking at and realizing the things that they value. It gave us the opportunity to reflect upon the things that we value in our lives, the things that we are grateful for. And I don't know that in any ordinary year, we would have, all of us would have invested in that thought. But certainly, so I'm hopeful for the future, and I'm grateful for what I have.
Well, I think that's a great way of ending, being grateful for what we have and being hopeful for the future. And now that we're beginning a new year, I can't imagine seeing it any other way, huh? Gratefulness and hope. Thank you, the four of you, so much for being here with me and sharing your thoughts on 2020 and 2021.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. Always great.
Thanks, Henrietta.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much.
Well, you heard it. My guests on this show talked about hope and gratefulness. We can all be grateful that we made it through 2020, and we can hope that 2021 will be better. Until next time.